but we'll begin the recording now. Good morning, everyone. Boker Tov. We are starting a new tractate of Mishnah, Mishna Avot, better known as Pirkei Avot, this morning. Congratulations, Mishna Mavens, on having completed Mishnah Brachot, the very first tractate in the Mishnah. Mishna Avot, or Pirkei Avot, is found at the very tail end of the order Nizikin, which is one of the 6 orders of the Mishnah. You'll recall that from our very first class that Mishnah is a work of 6 orders arranged topically. Each order contains subsections, which are called tractates. Each tractate in Hebrew is called a masechet. Each order, the larger, it's like phylum and genus and species. The larger body, the order, is called a seder, which means order. And then within each tractate or masechet, we have chapters, and within each chapter, we have individual teachings or mishnayot, which are teachings which were conveyed orally until they were written down sometime in the first 2 to 3 centuries of the Common Era. And then redacted under the authority of Rabbi Judah Hanasi, Yehuda Hanasi, who's sometimes just called Judah the Prince in English, or simply Rabbi. In the later Talmudic literature, when the Talmud refers to Rabbi, they mean Judah Hanasi, the great compiler of the Mishnah, sometime in the first half of the 3rd century, so sometime around the year 225, 230, 235 of the Common Era. We believe the Mishnah was codified, compiled, written down, and as it were, canonized, so that it remained basically an unchanging document from there forward. Let's offer our let's offer our blessing for study together. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So a couple words of preface on Pirkei Avot, since we are now well seasoned in the study of Mishnah, and I think it's nice not to start with Pirkei Avot, though it is by far the most popular of the tractates of Mishnah. In fact, there are Jewish customs in many communities to study Pirkei Avot every day between Pesach and Shavuot. Other communities have a summer Pirkei Avot reading custom that Pirkei Avot is studied on the Sabbath, on Shabbat, throughout the summer, leading up to Rosh Hashanah. So there are times of the year when the Jewish tradition has invited a deeper consideration of Pirkei Avot, but that doesn't mean there's anything wrong at all with looking at it in November and forward. And depending on how much we enjoy this study, it may be the kind of thing that we do resume after we get to however far we'll get in December, and then we'll be on hiatus through the duration of my sabbatical. I return basically the very end of Pesach, which is quote unquote early this year or next year. Pesach will end around April 3rd or April 4th, and I'll return the next day. And I think that it might be nice to have a traditional Omer period study. That's the 7 weeks between Pesach and Shavuot, where we will resume our study of Pirkei Avot. It's one of my favorite texts. My 5th and final year of rabbinical school, I engaged in a semester-long independent study of Maimonides' commentary on Pirkei Avot. His is not the only, but perhaps the most famous of the medieval rabbinic commentaries on Pirkei Avot. So in addition to the primary source of Pirkei Avot, which is what we will study, there is just an absolute trove of meaningful and helpful commentary. And you may even want to pick up your own hardbound or paperback volume of Pirkei Avot, just order it online. I will need to do a little bit of research into which editions presently available through either bookseller or the publisher would be most recommended. I have a few that I like, and I will include them in the next email to the class, which comes from Natalie Rodriguez's desk most weeks within 24 hours of teaching. So stay tuned to your emails if you would like to pick up your own copy of Pirkei Avot. I'll give a little bit of guidance on that. A word about the work itself and the title. So Pirkei Avot, as I've said, is the last tractate in the order of the Mishnah called Nizikin, which means damages. The 6 orders of the Mishnah are Ziraim, which means seeds, agriculture, but which begins with brachot. So Mishnah Brachot, which we studied over the summer and into the fall, is the first tractate in the order about agriculture. And we saw the ways in which the cycles of growth and planting are related to the act, and eating especially, are related to blessing in the Jewish tradition. Or I should say, the art and act of blessing is directly related to agriculture and the earth's productivity. We saw, for instance, a number of comments in Mishnah Brachot on the connection between prayer and rain. And then we also saw 3 full chapters of Mishnah Brachot dedicated to blessings that are said over eating. So agriculture and blessing are therefore connected. We're going to skip over the next Mishnah, the next order of the Mishnah, which is called Moed. Moed is the Hebrew word for season or seasons or times. That's the Mishnah order that contains all of the laws about Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and Pesach, and all of the different holidays basically each get their own tractate of Mishnah, Sukkot, for instance. We are going to proceed to the next Mishnah. So it's Ziraim, Moed, Nizikin, which means damages, torts. That's the section under which Pirkei Avot is included, though it seems that Pirkei Avot is almost like an appendix, because it does not actually deal with halacha or Jewish legal precepts whatsoever, passingly perhaps. But in the 5 or 6 chapters of Pirkei Avot, it's 5 basic chapters, and then there seems to have been an additional addendum of a 6th. Very, very little, almost no halacha commentary on Jewish law is provided. So the framework of Pirkei Avot is totally different. It resides entirely within the realm of the ethical. It's kind of like the Poor Richard's Almanac of Judaism. Poor Richard's Almanac, of course, the famous publication by Benjamin Franklin that would include, and I think is most recognized for its inclusion of his witty and famous aphorisms on thrift and virtue and all of the things that Franklin believed went into living a good life or a life of goodness. Similarly, Pirkei Avot appears to be a handbook or manual for providing advice, particularly, again, for young scholars or rabbis in training. So the framework, as I've said before, for all of Mishnah, including especially Pirkei Avot, is that the writing was specifically by rabbis for rabbis. And in particular, I think you'll glean from Pirkei Avot that the intended audience would be young men, adolescent boys, whose scholarship was being encouraged and developed alongside principles of character that the rabbis felt were important for these young men or adolescent boys to cultivate in order to embody the role of teacher, guide, and judge among the Jewish people. So that's kind of what you need to know about the framework. The title is Avot, which is a complicated word in the Jewish tradition. Normally, we think of Avot as in the Avot prayer, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu ve'Elohei Avotenu ve'im. We add ve'imotenu in our Reformed tradition, egalitarian, adding the names of the matriarchs. Blessed are you, Adonai, God of our fathers, Avot, Avotenu, our fathers. But Avot is actually probably not intended to be translated as fathers here, even though the most common translation of Mishna Avot or Pirkei Avot is chapters of the fathers. Sometimes you'll see it as teachings of the fathers, sometimes you'll see it as the wisdom of the fathers, and sometimes a gender-sensitive translator will render it as teachings of our ancestors or the wisdom of the ancestors. But interestingly enough, avot is also a word in Mishnaic Hebrew that means broad categories. So for instance, in the Mishnah on the Sabbath, and in Mishnah Shabbat, we have a reference to what are called the 39 avot melacha. 39 avot of melacha is work. So Mishnah Shabbat provides us with the 39 activities that are restricted on the Sabbath. And interestingly, it calls them avot melacha, which I would translate as the principal categories of forbidden work on the Sabbath. Similarly, in the Mishnah, we also encounter the phrase avot tum'ah, in which I would translate as the principal categories of ritual impurity. So in Mishnah Tohorot, in the order that's all about purity, which is the last of the orders of the Mishnah, the 6 orders of the Mishnah, it's all about purity and purification. The terminology that the Mishnah itself uses is avot tum'ah, principal categories of ritual impurity, and then the rabbis will unpack each of those categories in sequence. So avot is a word that would better be translated as fundamental principles. So taken together, Pirkei Avot, Pirkei is the plural of perek. Perek means a chapter or a unit, and usually of text. So for instance, you can refer to a perek within the Torah, meaning a chapter of Torah. Prakim is the plural on its own, perek singular, prakim plural. When you combine it with another noun, construct form in Hebrew, prakim becomes pirkei. So Pirkei Avot I would translate as chapters of fundamental principles. So it is also possible, by the way, that the authors, being very wise, clever, intelligent rabbis, use this wording intentionally with a deliberate ambiguity in order to support multiple renderings. In other words, Pirkei Avot could mean both the teachings of the fathers and categories or chapters of fundamental principles. So we can't rule that out. Either way, you can see that this chapter or this order, this tractate of the Mishnah, Avot, Pirkei Avot, provides a kind of window into the reverence that the rabbis of the Mishnaic period had toward their predecessors, both their rabbinic predecessors, but especially the proto-rabbis. We've used that term in reference, for instance, to Hillel and Shammai and their respective schools. So Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai are held in high esteem, and they have a lot of words ascribed to them in Pirkei Avot. So we're going to actually get to Hillel and Shammai, if not today, then certainly by next week. And others whose names may or may not be familiar to you. I am sure that you will recognize several of the mishnayot that we study in Pirkei Avot. These are among the most famous of Jewish teachings, and I hope you'll have a number of sparks of recognition, maybe each in every class, when you learn a teaching from Pirkei Avot that conveys something you already knew from the Jewish tradition, you just didn't know its source. The likelihood is that each of us knows Pirkei Avot, perhaps without even knowing that we know Pirkei Avot. So with that in mind, I've now provided whatever I think preamble will help us understand the literature we're about to study together. We've said a blessing, correct? Okay, good. So I'm going to put the words of Pirkei Avot up on screen, chapter 1, and we'll just dive right in. I'm very excited about this. Pirkei Avot is one of my favorite texts to study but I haven't undertaken a systematic study of it for 20 years. So it's going to be really fun to come back to this text. And we're going to do a lot of Hebrew. And I just ask that you bear with me. I do this not to intimidate, but rather to encourage anyone who is considering deepening one's Hebrew skills, that Pirkei Avot is another great place to start, because a lot of these terms are going to be familiar. Again, I'm using Sefaria. All of this is online, but Pirkei Avot is the kind of thing that you really also want a hard copy. Moshe kibel Torah misinai. 4 very important words that start us off and that really dictate what Pirkei Avot chapter 1 is all about. Moshe is Moses. Kibel is the same root as Kabbalah or Kabbalat Shabbat. Kibel is the verb meaning received. Moshe received Torah, means Torah, misinai, from Sinai. So there you go. You probably didn't even realize how good you are at Hebrew. Moshe kibel Torah misinai. Moses received Torah at Sinai. Umisarah liYehoshua, and transmitted it to Joshua. V'Yehoshua lizakenim. Joshua transmitted it to the elders. Uzakenim li nevi'im, and the elders to the prophets. Unevi'im misaruha la'anshe Knesset Hagedolah. And the prophets transmitted it. The it is always the antecedent here is Torah. La'anshe Knesset Hagedolah, to the men of the great assembly. And this is not a thing that you would gender sensitize, because the men of the great assembly were in fact men. And we'll talk about what the great assembly was. So this is the first declaration of Pirkei Avot. Moses received Torah at Sinai, transmitted it to Joshua, Joshua to the elders to the prophets, and the prophets to the men of the great assembly. So it's a 5-fold transmission. Moses, Joshua, the elders, the prophets, and the men of the great assembly in a direct linear chain. And the word misarah, which comes up, it's the other verb for to transmit, is the same root as a word that some of you may know from studying with our wonderful rabbinic intern last year, Sasha Bacon, who continues to teach through the WRJ. She's teaching a class in Musar, which is the discipline of character development in Jewish thought, and is a subset of Hasidism. But Musar comes from the root mem samech resh, this root here, which means to transmit, or the word for tradition, right? So to convey or transmit is the same in Hebrew as the noun form means tradition. So the tradition was passed down, was conveyed from one person or group to the next, all the way to the so-called men of the great assembly. We'll talk in a minute about who they were or might have been. Hem amru shalosha devarim. They, presumably meaning the men of the great assembly, that this is just in sequence. So the hem, they, refers to the men of the great assembly. Amru, they said, shlosha devarim, 3 things. And here are the 3 things. Hevu mitunim badin, be patient in justice, or be patient, as they put here in the brackets, in the administration of justice. V'ha'amidu talmidim harbe, and raise up many disciples. Va'asu siyag laTorah, and make a fence around the Torah. So there's a lot going on in this Mishnah here. And I'd like to just start with what you notice about the first half of the first Mishnah of chapter 1 of Pirkei Avot. So up to the words great assembly. Moses received the Torah at Sinai and transmitted it to Joshua, Joshua to the elders to the prophets, and the prophets to the men of the great assembly. Before I tell you more about these men of the great assembly, what do you extract from this? Why does the text begin this way? What are the rabbis trying to do here? There are no wrong answers, but your conjectures are most welcome. My dad, you have a hand up.
You can't have greater authority than the way it's laid out.
Okay, excellent. So let's start with, I think, a very sound conjecture that this is about the establishment of rabbinic authority, right? You want to talk about what the rabbis are trying to do here. In other words, we see what the text is, but what's the subtext? What's the unanswered question? What's the reason that the rabbis start this way when you could have started Pirkei Avot anyway? I think that it is a really sound conjecture that what the rabbis are trying to do here is establish their own authority, not just as teachers of the law or teachers of the Jewish tradition, but actually heirs to a tradition that begins at Sinai and was, as it were, conveyed directly from the hands of Moses. So I like how you said it, Dad. You could not have greater authority than what is being presented here. Great. Other thoughts about what you might notice in the opening of this chapter?
No, push your hand.
You can raise your hand. You can unmic yourself if you like.
I just go in.
Oh, okay.
Can I? Go ahead.
Yeah.
Say
Am
something.
I on?
All right, we have some chit chat. So somebody wanted to speak, but I muted you because it was kind of like a background conversation.
Say something.
Okay, I'd like to comment a little bit.
Please,
Okay.
Ivan. Yep.
Me, this is, and I go back to the practical way of transmitting from the very learned, intelligent leaders of the concepts and the brachot and everything else to reach the widest members of, let's call it, the Jewish tribe. And successively, it reaches within 5 steps, however long it takes, all the way down to the people who work in the field, don't get rest for more than a couple of hours a day because they have to, produce everything, and they yet have to learn. And each stage is respected by the next, I don't want to call it lower stage, but the next stage that is less engaged in the intellectual conversation that the rabbi started, so that there is authority from stage to stage and transmission to the people who ultimately have to live the life. Very, very difficult. I know that from myself, my children, and everybody else, to live the lives of goodness that really begin wisely at the top, and then it's most often corrupted by the time it gets down to the bottom.
Right. That's beautifully elaborated. I think keeping with this theme of authority, transmission, and there's the question of how was this received by the people? Particularly, I think the rabbis are acknowledging, look, we are now centuries and centuries. We are just epochs removed from the moment of revelation. How do we convey the authority of this tradition in a way so that it does not get corrupted? So there's something being presented here, almost like the little household party game of telephone, right? So the rabbis wish to make the case for a faithful, or in the word of like digital music, we would call it a lossless conveyance of the tradition, that no data is lost, no information or authority has been corrupted on the way down. I think the bigger question, as Ivan raises, is, well, how do you get this to the worker in the field, right? Who is a poor, illiterate, and presumably sitting in the dust of the feet of the rabbis, to use a phrase that we're going to encounter momentarily. Thank you very much. Barbara.
I'm troubled by the term skinim, because for me, skinim is somebody that's old. It's not somebody that's wise. It's not a learned person. It's a zaken who can be walking down the street and he's just old.
So let me respond to that with the advantage of the Torah portion this week, Chaye Sarah, which is the first place in the Torah where the word zaken, or the singular form of zkenim, which means here elders or old people, is used. It is not the only word in the Torah to denote old age. There are a number. Sometimes you'll read that a person was zaken v'saveah, meaning filled up or filled with years or satiated. The rabbis elsewhere in the Midrash comment that a zaken was a term reserved for people who had attained the reputation for reverence and wisdom. In other words, it wasn't something that you just threw out to any old person. It is not so much a designation of chronological age as it is spiritual maturity. Now, again, that I'm not sure that that's true to the root of the word, which probably just means an old person or an old guy. But the way the rabbis understand zaken is that it has the force of a person deserving of veneration. And let me use this also as the jumping off point for the comment on the zakenim here. The elders whom are mentioned, remember the order is Moses receives the Torah at Sinai, transmits Joshua, who is his hand-picked successor. So much, when I say hand-picked, I mean that literally Moses lays hands on Joshua in order to ordain him as his successor. I use the word ordain very deliberately because the laying on of hands is also the way in which rabbinic authority was passed from one rabbi to his pupil or disciple who was being ordained. Joshua passes it to the zakenim, to the elders. And the elders are a group that are identified as early as Exodus. I believe chapter 24 is the first time we have mention of the elders. After the revelation at Sinai, the 10 Commandments are given in the middle of chapter 20 of the book of Exodus. But Moses stays up on Mount Sinai, you'll recall, and there's a whole directory of other biblical laws that are given. It's not just the first 10, it's hundreds and hundreds, dozens of other laws that are going to be incumbent upon the Jewish people and that Moses will have to come down from Sinai to convey to the Israelites. But at the end of chapter 24 of the book of Exodus, Moses arranges for a kind of landing party to come back up Mount Sinai with him to have an audience, as it were, before the very throne of God. And that audience consists of the elders of the community, and there are 70 of them. So it seems that even from the earliest moments following the revelation at Sinai, the Torah takes pains itself, this is not the rabbis, but the Torah itself seems to designate that the authority of that revelation is going to be shared beyond Moses. Moses is not an exclusive repository of the law, though he is the principal conduit or conveyor of the law. So Joshua clearly has a kind of council of elders to support his leadership that connect Joshua also to the legacy of Moses. Then from the elders, the transmission is directly to the prophets, and the prophets finally to the so-called Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, the men of the Great Assembly. The most likely culprit in identifying these men of the Great Assembly would be the leaders of the Judahite or the Judean community post-Babylonian exile. So we're talking about very late 6th century BCE, early 5th century BCE. So the exile began in 586 with the conquest by Nebuchadnezzar of Babylonia. We know that the leadership of Judah, or Judea at the time, which really was the Jewish state, the Commonwealth, was vanquished and, as it were, decapitated, that the elite of that Commonwealth were either killed or carted off in chains. And we have, gory evidence that the king himself had his eyes put out and was made of a subject of the court of the king of Babylonia, Nebuchadnezzar. 70 years later, after the overthrow of the Babylonians by Cyrus of Persia, or Koresh, a return of exiles is made possible so 70 years later, let's say it's 516 or thereabouts, and you have a reconstitution of Jewish sovereignty, though as a vassal state to the Persian Empire, starting in the late 6th century, early 5th century BCE. The leaders of that Jewish Commonwealth post-exile are probably the people whom the rabbis are referring to when they talk about the men of the Great Assembly, which also provides us with an assurance. The rabbis, I think, want to assure us that the exile in Babylonia, which was by far at this point in biblical history the most catastrophic event to befall the Israelite community, nevertheless did not disrupt the chain of Torah transmission, or you might even say the flow of revelation that begins at Sinai. So bridging the gap of that 70 years of exile, you have a transmission from the prophets to the men of the great assembly, almost as if the exile itself never happened. And we know, by the way, that some of the prophets, including Jeremiah, went into exile with the people. Jeremiah actually talks about this in the book of Jeremiah, and Ezekiel as well intersects his lifespan, and his prophecy intersects with the experience of exile. So I think the rabbis want to make a strong case that just because the Jewish people were exiled from their homeland in this catastrophic period of Jewish history does not imply that the transmission of revelation was broken. In fact, the chain is unbroken, seems to be the one of the most important points that this text makes. Michelle, you have a hand up.
Yeah, hi. Is this proof text for the tradition that the oral Torah was also handed down from Sinai?
Precisely. Thank you. So you and Alan Markowitz, who sent me a private chat, said exactly the same thing. So bonus points for you and Alan. This is exactly right. So what is being established here is not just the authority of Moses and Torah at Sinai, which is the so-called written Torah, but also the validity, the authority in Jewish tradition of the so-called oral Torah, that it is no less revealed, although the mechanism or mechanisms for its revelation are considerably different, and there are all sorts of internal debates within the Jewish community, within the rabbinic community in antiquity, and even up to the present day, about what is meant when we talk about oral Torah. Does it mean that, for instance, every conversation that Jews have about Torah that results in insights being quote unquote revealed from the tradition are in fact just rediscovering what was sent forth at Sinai? That's a beautiful way of looking at it. I tend to favor that interpretive line, even though I recognize that it's more poetic and philosophical than it is perhaps scientific. My point being that, isn't it nice for us to consider that what we're doing here right now today over Zoom is just an extension of the revelation at Sinai and part of the oral Torah? Or, as is, I would say, the more conservative lowercase c position, is the oral Torah actually referring to a specific body of wisdom that later itself gets codified, starting with the Mishnah and the Talmud, and that only that which was written down by the sages in their respective eras is oral Torah. So I hope I've articulated for you the two different philosophical outlooks on what we mean when we talk about oral Torah. Either way, however, this text, I think, validates the both the fact of and the authority of the oral Torah in addition to the written Torah. So excellent observation. Nancy Siegel, you unmuted yourself. Did you have a comment?
Well, I wrote it in the chat. I'll say it. So I was just wondering if they, when they're passing it down, is it word for word, or are they interpreting on the way down? That's what I
Right.
wrote.
So that again touches on what I just said. I mean,
Right.
oral Torah is by its nature an interpretive body of literature. And yet the rabbis seem to be shoring up the authority of their own interpretive literature as part of what can be considered Torah. And that's why Torah is a confusing word in Jewish tradition. I mean, even the Bible, when it uses the word Torah, it isn't clear that they mean, in fact, they probably do not mean the 5 books of Moses written out on a single stitched together parchment scroll. We actually know that the so-called technology for preparing a Torah scroll, the way we have a Torah scroll at the temple, did not exist before the 1st century of the Common Era. So when the Bible or the Torah itself refers to the word Torah, it almost certainly means anything but a single stitched together parchment document on 2 rollers with all 5 books of Moses compiled together. What does it mean? Well, it depends on the context. When the book of Deuteronomy uses the word Torah, it probably refers to a collection of chapters from the book of Deuteronomy on a single parchment, on a single wooden pole. Even the idea of a double-rolled Torah did not exist until the 1st century. So there's no evidence that the Torah when the Torah refers to the word Torah, that it means the Torah the way we understand the Torah. That's like mental jujitsu part 1. The second is that when the rabbis talk about this so-called oral Torah, how much did they really believe that what they were doing was revelation, that they were just, as it were, mouthpieces for that which had already been revealed to Moses at Sinai? And how much were they interpreting or even innovating within the law? It's hard to know, because if they do believe that all they're doing is interpreting, they are very good about keeping up the act of this is revealed legislation or revealed wisdom from Sinai. And even the Mishnah and the Talmud itself provides us with a kind of mixed or self-contradicting picture on this very important question. So on the one hand, yes, the rabbis want to suggest that what they are doing, the Rabbinic Project, that is, of course, first codified, as I've said, in the Mishnah, that this project is just an extension of whatever God did for Moses and the people at Sinai. So on the one hand, the rabbis, I think, hold up that myth with a capital M, which, by the way, I almost never use to disparage when I refer to something as a myth. I mean a master story. All civilizations have their myths. They are required for the successful understanding and functioning of the civilization or society by the people who are either members of it or adjacent to it. So the self-perpetuated myth that what the rabbis are doing is merely an extension of revelation at Sinai is one idea that you see consistently throughout the quote-unquote oral law from the Mishnah and the Talmud. On the other hand, you have a number of anecdotes in the Talmudic literature itself that seem to suggest that the rabbis are a little bit more self-aware that what they are doing is self-consciously interpretive and wildly creative, and in some ways deviates from the master tradition. And the most famous of those examples, though I wish I could remember exactly the Talmudic citation, is a story about Moses, who manages to time travel to a classroom being taught by Rabbi Akiva. So let's say Moses lived, 1200 BCE, and Akiva is a 2nd generation sage who lived in the first half of the 2nd century of the Common Era. So, we know that Akiva was alive during the Bar Kokhba revolt, so 135. This is the time of Akiva. So that's a long time. That's, the better part of 13 centuries, give or take, between, or more, 13, 14 centuries between the purported Moses and the actual Akiva. And the Talmud records this fanciful and wonderful story where Moses finds himself in the back row of Akiva's yeshiva, Akiva's classroom, and he has no idea what they're talking about. And he sees that the teacher, Akiva, is elucidating meaning and meaning upon meaning, it says, like meanings within meanings, from even the calligraphy crowns, the ornamental crowns on top of the letters of the Torah, which is probably itself a metaphor or an image. So the image is that Akiva is getting into these incredibly granular details of scripture and providing these incredibly imaginative interpretations of the Torah. And Moses is sitting there in the back room, and he turns to God and he says, I have no idea what's happening here. And at that moment, Akiva says, and we know that this is the halakha. So Akiva says, and we know that this, whatever he's talking about, is the law, because it was a teaching from Moses at Sinai. So Moses hears himself referenced in this conversation, and the passage ends with the Talmud reporting that Moses was comforted. So that when Moses heard this, when he heard the teacher saying, and we know that this is so because it was given by Moses at Sinai, Moses is comforted because he realizes that no matter how foreign the tradition seems to him 1400 years later, nevertheless, the Jewish people continue to teach in his name and that the tradition is unbroken. So it's a fascinating dilemma, I think, that Nancy has pointed out in how both the rabbis in their era understood the meaning of their project and also how we in our era are supposed to understand the meaning of what the rabbis were doing. Was it? I think you know where I come down. I mean, I believe that it's wildly interpretive and creative, but out of a sense of humility, and I don't think it's false humility. I don't think this is, affective piety. I think the rabbis really believed that what they were doing was participating in a revealed tradition, that it was their responsibility exclusively to preserve and convey to the next generation. I mean, so on the one hand, there's this incredibly conservative, again, lowercase c impulse, literally to conserve the tradition, to preserve, to survive, to make sure that the tradition as they understood it would remain intact. And then you have this counter-prevailing impulse, which recognizes that, but the world of the Torah has radically and fundamentally been altered, namely by the cataclysm of destruction, imperial conquest, and exile, right? So you have these massive upheavals in how Jewish civilization and therefore Jewish religion were going to be constituted leading up to the rabbinic period. The rabbis have to respond on the one hand to the need for radical change and creativity, and on the other hand, they have to preserve the Jewish project of the last 1400 years as something that has its original integrity intact. Okay, I think I've given enough of a kind of a spiritual overlay, but without this, I don't think our text would be very meaningful. Dad, I see your hand went back up.
I'm struggling a little bit with the function of the prophets along this chain because, the purpose of prophecy, I always thought the prophets got their revelation directly. And theirs, in some sense, is their function is to prophesy, to tell what's going to come. They seem to be different. One of these things is not like the other things.
Fantastic. Yeah, so glad you pointed that out and that you prevented me from just jumping ahead and glossing over that. I think you're right on. I think that if you look at it, one of these things really is not like the other in that one could rightly ask, if you study the literature of the prophets in the Hebrew Bible, since when do prophets represent a direct chain of tradition that starts with Moses, right? We think of prophets as being mouthpieces for divine revelation in a kind of self-contained way, right? Each prophet has his or her own relationship with God, and usually there's a direct communication from God to the prophet, through the prophet to the people. And that each prophet has a different message, although there's overlap, and each prophet, by the way, has a different means of conveyance of the message. So my favorite, for instance, you have the kind of garden variety. God comes to Jonah, God comes to Isaiah, says, I got a job for you. And they either say, in the case of Jonah, no, thank you, and try to run away. Or in the case of Isaiah, Hineni, here I am, shalcheni. He says, Hineni, shalcheni, here I am, send me. The reluctant prophet is the more common motif. And then you have somebody like Ezekiel, who's a complete, nutso. God hands him, according to Ezekiel, God appears to him and gives him a scroll with words on it that he's not able to understand. And God tells him to eat the scroll. And Ezekiel puts it in his mouth and eats it. And at that moment, he attains the ability of prophecy. So yeah, so clearly the rabbis in the opening of Pirkei Avot are appropriating, that would be a gentle word, they are appropriating, co-opting the entire notion of prophecy, and I think regulating prophecy as part of the chain of transmission that starts with Moses and goes all the way down to the men of the Great Assembly. And I'm going to go one step further. what's implied in this text that I want you to notice, but you can notice it only in the negative space, right? You can notice it only by reading between the lines. What I believe is implied here is that the rabbis are the direct heirs to the men of the Great Assembly, because now they're going to begin quoting the teachings of the men of the Great Assembly. They said three things: be patient in the administration of justice, raise many disciples, and make a fence around the Torah, which the rabbis take these three principles as core guiding precepts for their project. And I'm using the word project kind of, I'm not saying they had like a strategic vision and a plan and a task force and all of that, but it's clear that the rabbis are communally and collectively engaged in a shared project that is guided by these three ideas: be patient in the administration of justice. So rabbis are judges. They are the ones who are charged with adjudicating matters of Jewish law and practice for the Jewish community. Raise many disciples. I mean, that's actually the whole point of Pirkei Avot. It seems to be about the cultivation of discipleship. And make a fence round the Torah. We'll talk about that last phrase because it's fascinating. So I think that what the rabbis are doing, without saying so, again, maybe out of humility, which I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt is not false humility. Maybe what the rabbis are doing here is saying, and what is implied is, we're next. We're the sixth in the chain of five that come before us. And in so doing, they are appropriating the power of prophecy itself. Remember that the rabbis are the same ones who said that prophecy has ceased from Israel, not just the land of Israel, but from the people. The rabbis declared no more prophecy. That happens at the same time as the Mishnah is being developed and compiled. The rabbis make a declaration that at the time the temple was destroyed, prophecy ceased in Israel. So the rabbis want to make it very clear that God reveals the divine word and law to the Jewish people in the following way, but no longer through the prophets. The way in which it happens is God gave it to Moses, Moses gave it directly to Joshua, Joshua directly to the elders gave it to the prophets, which again is not consistent with what the Bible tells us about how prophecy works. Thank you, Dad, for observing that. And the prophets to the men of the Great Assembly. And therefore what the rabbis are saying is, I believe, we are now the authoritative quote unquote prophets for the Jewish people. We have the tradition, no one else does. And it also hedges against the problem that seems to have arisen even in Torah times. The book of Deuteronomy goes on at quite some length about what do you do when a person stands up in the public square and says, I'm a prophet? How do you know if the prophet is a real prophet? So it seems as if even from the time of the Torah itself, biblical people had a real dilemma on their hands with how do you know who's a real prophet and who's a fake prophet? And the wisdom that Deuteronomy provides on this is internally inconsistent. It's self-contradictory. On the one hand, you have verses in the book of Deuteronomy that says, well, the way you know you've got a real prophet is if the prophet forecasts something to happen, an oracle, right? If the prophet provides you with an oracle, a prediction, and it comes true, then you should believe the prophet. But if it does not come true, then he's not a real prophet. Okay, that does not withstand the logic smell test, by the way. The other criterion that is provided is if the prophet speaks in the name of a foreign god, someone other than the God of the Hebrews, Yahweh. Even if the prophecy comes true, do not believe him, he's a false prophet. So which is it? And all I want to point out is not so much how to resolve the dilemma, but merely the fact of the dilemma. The dilemma being that even in biblical times, the Jewish community seems to have been divided by or assailed by the phenomenon of anyone being able to get up in the public and say, hi, I'm a prophet. God spoke to me last night. I talk about this a lot when I contemplate, for instance, I often have had the privilege of interfacing and teaching young rabbinical students. Some of my favorite work, we have rabbinic interns and cantorial interns at WRT. It's a time-honored tradition and part of our partnership with Hebrew Union College to develop tomorrow's Reformed Jewish leaders. And of course, you know and love our interns, Ariel and Isaac. And every few years we get some new interns, and it's just one of the best things about WRT, and it's one of the best things about being a rabbi at WRT. Additionally, I get to go to their seminars and classes, and occasionally I'm brought in to teach, usually homiletics, usually the practice or art of sermon writing, preaching. And I never forget my first homiletics class at Hebrew Union College in my third year. I skipped out of homiletics my second year, which was just public reading and speaking. I passed out of that class because I had done a lot of public speaking in high school and college. But my third year, I began homiletics, which is sermon writing. And Rabbi Ken Ehrlich, our teacher, had a fantastic here, I just want to make sure I'm having some problems highlighting screens today, so there I am for you. Had a fantastic way of beginning class. So he says, imagine that it is Yom Kippur. Let's say it's Kol Nidre, and you're the new assistant rabbi of Congregation Rodef Kesef, which was one of his jokes, by the way, which means those who pursue money. But so Congregation Rodef Kesef, and you get up there on Kol Nidre and you begin your sermon like this. Brothers and sisters, last night the Lord spoke to me in a vision or a dream, and this is what God wants from you, and that's where you go. And of course, we all laugh because it's funny, and we all recognize that that would be career suicide in the rabbinate. And that's true whether you're Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, Reconstructionist, or no affiliation at all. There is no present-day Jewish modality where the rabbi can authoritatively stand up in front of the congregation and declare that the authority of the rabbi comes from a direct communication with God. And that's, of course, it's probably intuitively obvious to us because we've been swimming in the sea of Judaism, most of us anyway, for a very long time. And it is entirely normative to expect that the rabbi will say lots of interesting things or maybe not so interesting things, maybe bold and provocative things from the Bima, but the rabbi is not going to claim that God directly spoke to him or her. But in many Christian congregations, this is not a fringe phenomenon in world religions. It is entirely plausible that the preacher can get up in front of the congregation and say, brothers and sisters, I had a dream in which God spoke to me. And of course, you're hanging on every word because it is authoritative in that tradition for the preacher to speak in the name of God. This really comes down to how Rabbinic Judaism came to frame the question of revelation. And what we learned in that first class on homiletics, was all about from what sources does a rabbi's authority derive? And the answer is two. There are only two sources of rabbinic authority. One is the rabbi's knowledge of and familiarity with Jewish text and tradition. So the authority flows from the literary tradition itself and one's conversancy or fluency in that tradition, one's depth of education and knowledge about that tradition. That's one source of rabbinic authority. The other source of, I would say there may be three. The other source of rabbinic authority comes from the rabbi's own experience, which can include both his or her personal experience, but also the experience of being invested with authority by the community, right? So it is that I rabbi to my congregation by consent of those to whom I am or for whom I am the rabbi, as represented by the Board of Trustees. So in the context of Westchester Reformed Temple, my authority when I speak from the Bima derives from, I'd say, three sources. My ordination as a rabbi, which signals that I am conversant enough in the Jewish tradition to teach Jewish tradition and adjudicate matters of Jewish practice, from my investiture by the congregation itself as their rabbi, and from my own vast life experience as a rabbi. And that's it, which is why rabbis tend to be a profession where they get better with age. Not all, but at least the experiential component actually directly benefits the rabbi. So a few thoughts on rabbinic authority. Now, look, I think it's still unreasonable for rabbis to claim that they speak with the authority of the prophets, but it's clear to me that what the rabbis are trying to do in the opening line of Pirkei Avot is establish a direct case for their authority as revealers or revelators of the Jewish tradition as given to Moses at Sinai. And maybe even in so doing, reclaim the term and the power of prophecy, so that it is now no longer conveyed directly from God to a person, but rather through text to a collective, that is to say, the rabbinic community. That's a lot. How's everyone feeling about all this so far? You following? Okay, great. So let's, and of course, day one, we always do more preamble. Somebody texted me, thank you, Russell. For your benefit, I've changed my virtual background to the Men of the Great Assembly. Now I actually have to see you here. Okay, this is fantastic. In case you can't see Russell, there he is. So, hi. You've actually been there, though. That's not just a virtual background, right? Did you take that picture yourself?
Yes, I did.
Great, cool. Okay, I'm gonna carry on then. You should see my video spotlighted, right? Okay, good. Let's go back to our text. The three things that the men of the Great Assembly taught that the rabbis want to lead with, I have described as fundamental precepts for the Rabbinic Project. Hem amru shalosha devarim. They said three things. And by the way, Pirkei Avot is very fond of mnemonics, not only threes. There's a lot of things that occur in, certain discrete, with an ETE, units that are easily remembered. 3 of this, 5 of that, 10 of this. So 3 is very common in rabbinic writing. There's probably some human psychology to back up the ability of human beings to remember things in sets of 3. So they said 3 things. Be deliberate or patient, mitunim. Be mitunim badin, in administering justice, which the rabbis would later comment in the Talmud means that you have to listen to every witness, present his or her testimony. If the verdict of a particular case that a rabbi would adjudicate, remember, rabbis were the adjudicators of matters of Jewish law for their communities, and Jewish law is not just, is my chicken kosher? Jewish law covers all sorts of issues, torts and damages and interrelationships among people who are engaged in business and commerce together, and real estate, property law, marital, divorce, family law. All of these issues were under the jurisdiction of the rabbinical community. So be patient in the administration of justice, because serving as judges in the rabbinical sense was a core function of the rabbinate. Raise many disciples, the ha'amidu, raise up, cause to stand, talmidim harbe, many disciples, va'asu siyag laTorah. It's this last one that I think should attract our greatest interest this morning, and make a fence around the Torah. Anyone want to venture a guess on what the rabbis mean by make a fence around the Torah? What do you think this refers to? How does it function? What's going on here? The other two I'm saying are simply more self-evident. Michelle had a hand up and then it went down.
I don't want to be the only one talking, but traditionally it means that you don't just worry about doing the wrong thing, but you build a barrier, a buffer. So it's not just you, I don't know, don't light a candle on Shabbat. You put the matches away. You take extra steps back. So kashrut, well, all of a sudden, heaven forbid, you should see the lamb in its mother's milk, means that you have to wait 6 hours after a meat meal to have ice cream for dessert.
Great. Using what I think might be one of the most relatable and well understood examples. Exactly, Michelle. I think that you kind of just captured it. Look, there are many laws from the Torah and in the rabbinic understanding of Jewish law that are not strictly obligatory upon a person. We would use the Aramaic word deoraita, and it's important. We've used these words before, but I don't expect that you've mastered all this arcane terminology. Deoraita is the Aramaic word that means from the Torah. D'Rabbanan is the Aramaic term that means from the rabbis. And Jewish law, rabbinic law, does distinguish in force between deoraita law and d'Rabbanan law. Namely, that if you can substantiate that a precept or a law is deoraita, is established in the Torah, by the Torah, with the authority of the Torah, that is considered hierarchically more authoritative than laws that are d'Rabbanan, laws that were brought to the Jewish community by the rabbis, either through interpretation or what is called takana, which means a rabbinic edict. Sometimes the rabbis use their own authority, I think, to issue what is called a takana. And there are a number of examples of this, though I'm gonna get tongue-tied if I try and call one to mind without thinking about this in advance. So the most famous might be one by Hillel, who issued, but it's not actually called a takana, but he came up with a legal workaround for the fact that the Bible calls for, the Torah calls for a remission of all debts. So creditors would be expected to forgive debts in the seventh or sabbatical year of every 7-year cycle. And the Jubilee year in particular was a time this is only for the Jubilee year. And that when the 50th year was approaching, creditors would be loath to forgive the debt that the people to whom they had lent had accumulated. And so Hillel came up with a halachic or a legal workaround called a prosbul, which was a writ that allowed the debt to be carried over across the Jubilee year. It's a bit arcane. You may be familiar or unfamiliar with that. But getting back to the question of a fence around the Torah, there are many laws that are not. Yes.
Does it have anything to do with keeping the Torah for the Jewish people and not for others?
I don't think so, and let me comment on that in a moment. I'm going to return to that. Let me say what I think siyag la Torah, or fence around the Torah, or fence for the Torah means first, and then I'll take up. Was that Dottie?
Yes.
Let me take up what I think Dottie is asking as well. So there are many laws that are not strictly obligatory upon a person deoraita from the Torah, but rather were instituted d'Rabbanan by the rabbis in order to prevent a Jewish person from transgressing a Torah law. So Michelle gave us the example of don't eat milk and meat even in the same 6-hour span as an example of a fence around the Torah law, thou shalt not boil a kid in its mother's milk. Another example would be the use of money on Shabbat. The Torah itself does not prohibit using money on Shabbat. However, the rabbis institute that one should not do so that one would not transgress the Torah law of writing on Shabbat, at least as the rabbis understood it. The rabbis understood that writing was one of the restrictions that was forbidden by the Torah for Shabbat. But then there are subsidiary things that you don't want to do. There are lots of ones that, since there are 39 quote unquote biblically forbidden categories of work on Shabbat, the Avot Melacha, the fundamental categories of work, which, by the way, the Torah itself never explicitly says, here are the 39. That too is in the rabbis' literature. It's in the Mishnah. It's in Mishna Shabbat. The Mishnah says, here are the 40 minus 1. That's how it phrases the number 39. Here are the 40 minus 1 avot melacha, fundamental categories of work that are restricted on the Sabbath. And then it provides all 39. It goes, if you look at them, the common thread connecting the 39 categories of restricted work on the Sabbath are all things that went into building the tabernacle in the wilderness. That's why you're not allowed, for instance, to tan hides on the Sabbath, because tanning hides was part of the preparation for the outer covering of the tabernacle. It's why you're not allowed to sew stitches, multiple stitches, because stitching together fabric and hide was part of what went into building the tabernacle. It's why you're not allowed to drive a nail on Shabbat. It's why you're not allowed to, and apparently, we don't need to get into this, but there are other subsidiary considerations, including writing, which the rabbis consider to be forbidden by the Torah on the Sabbath. And so the worry is that if you transact money, you're going to have to sign a document or, write a chit to validate the transaction, and that would be violating a Torah law. Similarly, we know you can't play musical instruments on Shabbat. That's why if you go to an Orthodox shul on Shabbos, you won't hear any nice instrumental music. But there's nothing in the Torah or even in the rabbinic literature, at least in the Mishnah, that says you can't play a musical instrument. What you're not allowed to do, however, is if your instrument breaks in the course of playing it, you wouldn't be allowed to fix it. And so the rabbis say to avoid the temptation of having to fix your musical instrument, which you might break in the course of your playing it on the Sabbath, just don't play it on the Sabbath. Again, we can question the wisdom of a tradition that is fundamentally more about restrictions than it is about permissions. I happen to feel that a Sabbath that is only about what you cannot do is a particularly joyless Shabbat. But that's a subjective evaluation that a Reform rabbi is providing in the year 2020. So I want to just make the disclaimer that's not particularly fair of me I'm not here to disparage the tradition. I'm here to teach the tradition. I'd add on the subject of kashrut, and then I'll get to Dadi's question. There's this famous joke about Moses is up on Mount Sinai and he's reading over the 10 Commandments and he says, okay, I get it, I think, thou shalt have no other gods before me and honor thy father and mother and thou shalt not murder, steal, covet, commit adultery. Okay, what's this thing about thou shalt not boil a kid in its mother's milk? Like, where did that come from? And God says, well, Moses, it's exactly as I say. Don't boil a kid in its mother's milk. And Moses says, okay, I think I'm understanding you, Lord. So what you're asking me to do is that if I'm cooking a dish made with meat, I shouldn't have any dairy in and God says, no, Moses, listen to me. It's simple. Thou shalt not boil a kid in its mother's milk. And Moses says, oh, okay, forgive me. I'm so sorry. I'm a little slow. I think what you're saying is that we should have 6 hours of a wait period between eating meat and then enjoying ice cream. God says, no, Moses, thou shalt not boil a kid in its mother's milk. And Moses says, okay, finally, I think I understand. So you want us to have 3 different sets of dishes, one for meat, one for milk, one for Passover. God says, fine, Moses, do whatever the hell you want. So that's my famous joke about Siag la Torah. But it really is a joke that talks about this Mishnah in Pirkei Avot. Dadi's question is there a distinction that's being made in the text with Siag la Torah between what is incumbent upon Jews and what is incumbent upon Gentiles or non-Jews? And the answer is no, though the rabbis are concerned about that too. The rabbis are concerned about Jews versus Gentiles. But what I want to make clear here is that the stringency that appears to be promoted through this idea of making a fence around the Torah is incumbent upon Jews, and even I would say the least stringent attention to Jewish law is still incumbent only upon Jews. In the rabbinic way of understanding things, only 7 precepts, 7, as opposed to 613 mitzvot plus ongoing rabbinic oral Torah, only 7 precepts are incumbent upon Gentiles. They are the so-called Noahide laws, which is a rabbinic interpretation provided in the Talmud, I believe in Tractate Sanhedrin, on what the Jews are not, what Gentiles are not allowed to do. And if you look up here on the screen, I'll show you just briefly the Noahide laws. So you can see that I have a lot of text on the Noahide laws. Let's see if I can just get this up here. Our rabbis taught, Nedarim, which is the section of the Babylonian Talmud on oaths. Our rabbis taught 7 precepts were the sons of Noah commanded. Social laws, to refrain from blasphemy, idolatry, adultery, bloodshed, robbery, and eating flesh cut from a living animal. Social laws meaning these are the 7 basic precepts that are required for the successful functioning of any human civilization. You got to have some agreement that some things are out of bounds. And according to the Talmud, the rabbinic tradition, these 7 are the only 7 incumbent on Gentiles. Jews have everything else. 606 additional commandments incumbent on Jews. Social laws, meaning that which governs the basic functioning of civilization, to refrain from blasphemy, idolatry, adultery, bloodshed, robbery, and eating flesh cut from a living animal. If you don't follow those 7, even as Gentiles, then you are barbaric. You don't even deserve to be part of the human community. But everything that the rabbis were concerned about, other than that one passage, is incumbent upon Jews exclusively. So the delta, the difference between the bar that is set for Gentiles and Jews is just massive to begin with. And then you have this additional precept that Jews should build a siyag laTorah, a fence around the Torah, making it even more stringent for Jews to uphold Jewish law. Russell.
Well, thank you for your explanation. And in light of your historical explanation, it makes me think of the Torah and the life of the Torah as kind of a construction zone. And when someone builds a fence, you always have to ask yourself, are you keeping out or are you keeping in? On the basis of your description, I wonder if you're building a fence around this first to say, like, there's work going on here, keep out. It's the rabbis who are doing this, and I'm not sure I love that interpretation. And the second is to keep out foreign influences. Don't allow things into this construction zone that will contaminate it in some way. And both of them can lead to dangerous implications. So if I'm completely off base, please say so.
I think
I'm eager to know your thoughts on that.
It's not a phrase, but I think you're completely on base. There's something to be said for the dual function of a fence, and I think nobody got inside of that dialectic or duality than did Robert Frost in his poem Mending Wall, where it's wall, not fence, but something there is that doesn't love a wall. There's this really provocative ambivalence in that poem about, well, is it something there is that doesn't love a wall, or is it where he ends, good fences make good neighbors, right? Is what I'm doing with my neighbor each year after, the snow and the wind and the weather and the elves and the cows, I think, get framed as culprits too, knock certain stones out of the wall that divides the property between the speaker of the poem, the narrator, and his neighbor. And they go out for this annual springtime ritual of putting the rocks back in the wall. And the narrator ruminates on the meaning of this project. And there's still that ambivalence. Am I keeping out? Is this an act of isolationism in a bad way? Or is this a necessary boundary that is required for the successful functioning of neighborly relations? And I think we all have to deal with that both in literal and figurative ways. And I think that that's a most noteworthy and most Jewish response to the text in front of us. So let's live inside of the ambivalence, the double meaning. And let's do another Mishnah. Look, you could spend a semester on any one Mishnah from Pirkei Avot, and it was not my intention to get through, a whole chapter today. It was my intention to get through at least one Mishnah. I think we'll get through a second one as well. So this is Mishna Avot, Pirkei Avot, chapter 1, Mishnah 2. Shimon the righteous was one of the last men of the great assembly. So you notice where we're back to. This is about the rabbis reclaiming the authority of the tradition that came before them. Let's see if I can find it. It's actually a short Mishnah, and I was looking at some commentary, so sorry. Pirkei Avot, chapter 1. Here we go. Shimon HaTzadik haya Mishiarei Knesset Hagadola. Literally, he was one of the remnants. This word Mishiarei, one of the remnants of the Great Assembly. Hu Haya Omer, he used to say, Al Shlosha Divarim Ha'olam Omed. The world stands on three things: Al HaTorah, V'al HaAvodah, V'al Gemilut Chasadim. Now, words that are so well known in Jewish tradition that we even have songs. We set them to music. We incorporate them into our liturgy. Sometimes they are sung, although they're not part of the statutory liturgy for a service, they're often included in a prayer book, or they come at informal times of Jewish prayer. For instance, when you take the Torah scroll out of the ark, undress it, or before you undress it, you parade it around the sanctuary in what is called a hakafa, or a processional. That is often sung, these words, Al Shlosha Divarim Ha'olam Omed, Al Shlosha Divarim, Al Shlosha Divarim, Al Shlosha Divarim Ha'olam Omed, and it repeats, Al HaTorah, V'al HaAvodah, V'al Gemilut Chasadim. So the world stands on three things. Again, back to three, easy mnemonic. Remember, we're teaching young adolescents to remember the core ethical principles that will help them be good and faithful rabbis for the Jewish people. The world stands on three things: Al HaTorah, Ve'al HaAvodah, Ve'al Gemilut Chasadim. Now, it's easy to remember, but hard to translate and interpret. So Simon the Righteous, Shimon the Tzaddik, was one of the last of the Great Assembly, and we have this oral teaching from him, this precept. He used to say the world stands upon three things. One is on Torah, two is on Avodah, really hard word to translate, and the third is on Gemilut Chasadim. Here they say the practice of acts of piety. Gemilut Chasadim, good deeds, sometimes is the translation. Works of compassion. Avodah is the trickiest, the middle one. Avodah means work, and it can actually mean servitude. In Hebrew, the word for a slave or a servant is an eved. So what a servant or a slave does is avodah. Avodah also refers to worship or prayer. Avodah also refers to sacrificial service of any kind. Avodah also refers to a person's job. Avodah also refers to the temple, the ancient temple service, the Avodat HaKodesh, literally the holy service performed by the priestly community in biblical times. So again, I think that, Russell introduced us to an idea that contains a deliberate ambiguity. And I usually favor interpretive lines that suggest that the writers of this literature were sophisticated enough in their thought to be deliberate about the possible multiple meanings of what they were writing. So I want to suggest that I, for one, don't believe that the rabbis had only one thing in mind when they write Al HaTorah, Al HaAvodah, V'al Gemilut Chasadim. I would like to hear from you. How do you interpret this? What do you see inside the text of Shimon HaTzadik? So the world stands on three things, and not just about the three things, but what do you make of his claim that the world stands on these three things? What's the point here? What's getting conveyed? I'm just going to put it on the screen for one more moment and then invite anyone who wants to offer a thought, question, or comment to do so. Somebody asked me a good question in the chat box, by the way. How do we know that it's capital T Torah? We don't. So that's another place. Even the word Torah is potentially ambiguous. Do the rabbis mean Torah, the book, or do they mean Torah in the sense of Jewish law, oral Torah plus written Torah, or do they mean Torah in the most broad sense, by which I would say, I usually translate Torah to mean, in that context, accumulated Jewish wisdom, right? Whatever the Jewish people have been thinking, writing, teaching over our thousands of years is Torah. You never write Torah with a lowercase t, but that is, as it were, Torah with a lowercase t, as opposed to proper noun, capital T Torah, meaning the 5 books of Moses on a parchment scroll. So we don't know. That's another place of ambiguity. We also don't know what exactly is meant by Gemilut Chasadim. All of these terms are rich in their ambiguity. Dad, that's your hand.
I'm going to take a stab at this one because I'm a little at sea. But again, it seems to me that one of these things is not like the other. The Gemilut Hasadim is not like Torah or the rituals of a temple. They seem to be codified kinds of, well, let me get beyond that, but they seem to be codified, whereas the third seems to be an action call.
Lovely. I'll comment here. I'll give you a little bit of inside baseball on WRT in direct response to what my dad has said. This text is one of the core principles for how I have worked to organize, mentor, supervise, and create a vision for the clergy of Westchester Reformed Temple. So I've been, the senior rabbi of the congregation. I'm in my 10th year of serving the congregation as senior rabbi. And an essay that I read probably 15, 20 years ago, so earlier in my rabbinate, really stayed with me. And it was by our colleague, the great, now retired Rabbi Larry Kushner, Lawrence Kushner, who resides in the Bay Area, but who for a generation was the rabbi of a congregation in Sudbury, Massachusetts. And a great writer on I would call him a mystical populist or a popular mystic, maybe more accurately. He writes about, I would say, Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism, but and Neo-Hasidism, but at a very approachable, humane, popular level. He is not to be confused with Rabbi Harold Kushner, the celebrated rabbi and conservative rabbi and author of When Bad Things Happen to Good People. Both rabbis Kushner from Massachusetts. Harold Kushner is from Natick, Larry from Sudbury. But Rabbi Lawrence Kushner, Larry Kushner, wrote an essay in which he basically said he appreciated the innovation of modern day synagogues around new ways that people are organizing themselves. I'm sure he has a lot of thoughts on using Zoom to teach Torah and worship. But at the end of the day, he encouraged the reader to remember that we should not get distracted from what Judaism is here to provide. And he cited this text, that the primary products of Judaism, and therefore he went on to say, the primary products that a synagogue should be producing are Torah, Avodah, and Gemilut Chasadim. These are the building blocks of Jewish life. And he says, cut away all the frou-frou, stop trying to do innovative program this, and, let's do a kind of wine and cheese on the roof of a, skyscraper, whatever synagogues are doing to connect with their members. And look, I think member engagement is both the principal responsibility and challenge, particularly at this moment in American Jewish life. I speak, very much as a congregational rabbi, that it's both very gratifying just to have one-on-one connections and group connections with people right now, but it's been really challenging to figure out how does an organization that functions primarily on large gatherings become a congregation in the time of a pandemic. But Kushner's guidance is always with me. Make what your synagogue does about Torah, Avodah, and Gemilut Chasadim. With my clergy team, the way in which we've loosely translated these three categories are: Torah is education, Avodah is worship or prayer, spiritual life, and Gemilut Chasadim is pastoral care. Everything that goes into giving love, sharing love, and being fully present for people in their time of need. It also encompasses the social action dimension of our work. The doing of good deeds. And that at the end of the day, what I think the unique value proposition of synagogues, which is particularly pronounced right now, is that we are the organization in people's lives that provide worship, pastoral care, and Jewish learning. And synagogues often experience what I call mission drift because they forget that those are the three things, right? Those are the three things. We are not here necessarily to teach, I don't know. There are 100 different things that I see synagogues doing that don't strike me as particularly mission-centered. You know, somebody said to me, well, could the temple do a drive-in movie night? And the answer is we could, and we would have to invest considerable resources of time, energy, thought, and especially money into that. But the question becomes, does it actually reflect what synagogues can do in our lives? It comes down to the fundamental question, why do we need synagogues, or why do we need a Jewish community? And I believe the answer is because the synagogue is the primary producer in people's lives, or the primary organizing engine for Torah, Avodah, and Gemilut Chasadim. And those are three things you can cobble them together on your own. You can have your own independent course of Jewish study. You can learn and enrich your Jewish life. You can certainly find ways to pray without a synagogue, and you can certainly do lots of good deeds. But only the synagogue provides these three as the basic elements of Jewish living in a kind of package. So I believe that when synagogues get too far away from Torah, Avodah, and Gemilut Chasadim, we really are losing our sense of direction. So that's forgive me for the sermon, but I wanted to share that with you because I want you to understand that anytime somebody throws a good program my way, it's one of the first questions in my mind is, you know, yes, it's a nice painting, but is it art? Well, so yes, it's a beautiful idea to have a turkey dinner with, you know, a great speaker that somebody heard at the Scarsdale Public Library. But is it Judaism? I don't have an answer to that. I think we try to be innovative and creative within that space. I just don't ever want us to get so far that people could come to WRT and not remember that what they got was some version of Torah, Avodah, and Gemilut Chasadim. Other thoughts on this text? It's a rich and important text. Somebody else described it as three legs of a stool. Yes, three, right? You need three to be stable. And by the way, I would say they also exist in three different dimensions of human activity. Torah, which is intellectual, prayer, which is spiritual, and Gemilut Chasadim, which is physical in a sense, right? It's an embodied thing. You need your hands, you need to roll up your sleeves and pack those lunches for the food bank. You need to pick up the phone and call the lonely person. In a non-COVID time, not just the rabbi, but you should be performing Bikor Cholim, visiting the sick, visiting the house of Shiva. These are Gemilut Chasadim in the Jewish tradition, and they are very much an embodied tradition, as opposed to the pure intellect of Torah and the heart and spirit of Avodah. So that's another way of thinking about this, that you can find a place in the self where these three categories reside or lodge. Judy Gross and Michelle Braun, some thoughts from you, please.
To me, the thinking of Torah, all of this is so, as you've tied up what we do at WRT and why I'm so in love with that place in there, and tied to it as much as I can, according to the education and the avodah and the doing of good deeds. But I think also when we think of Torah, it has to be the divine. You have to tie, if you have any spiritual inklings or philosophical thoughts, I think one can tie this to the divine. The Torah is not just a piece of paper, and you can have its teachings. It is our laws, it is our teaching, but there's something unique about the Torah. And I think bringing the thoughts of the divine, whatever way one interprets the divine, I think it has to be connected, and it has to be capital T. I don't think what they're talking about here is Torah. That's our everyday teachings and laws. It's something very different. And even in the works of worship, you have to think and accept the divine. And I'm all really, really loosely divine. It's above the mundane. Maybe just that.
Beautiful.
And then do good stuff, because in doing all that, we have to get out there in the world and be good to each other and love each other. So that's my interpretation.
Beautiful interpretation. I'm so grateful that you shared it. And I also think that it's fascinating. I don't know this for sure, but it will be a very long time before we get to God in Pirkei Avot. And even then, not by name. Like, we're going to have to wait until we get to chapter 2, teaching number 12. That's a long time to have a Jewish text go without referencing God. And so I think it does beg the question, so where is God in all of this? Where is God in the Jewish project? Where is God in the Rabbinic project? And, is God always kind of just hovering, as it were, behind the scenes? Or are the rabbis perhaps mindful that when one engages in Torah, Avodah, and Gemilut Chasadim, not only does the world stand, but somehow God is made real, right? You remember that we talked about the purpose of the Shema. We actually talked about the timing and logistics for the Shema before we talked about the reason for the Shema. When we studied in Mishnah Brachot over the summer and fall. The timing and the logistics for Shema presume that you're supposed to do the Shema. You're supposed to say it when you go to bed. You're supposed to say it when thou liest down, when thou risest up, and so forth. But only a chapter or several later do you get to the point of the Shema is Kabbalat Ol Malchut Shamayim, to affirm that you have accepted the yoke, Y-O-K-E, of the kingdom of heaven upon you. In other words, the point of Shema is to affirm that God is real in the world. However, as you, Judy, and our beloved Rabbi Jack Stern of blessed memory would have always added as a disclaimer, whenever he used the word God in a public setting, he always said, however you choose to understand God, which I just think was so beautiful and one of the many, many ways in which he taught me. So I think the Shema, let's learn how to do it and when to do it. And then, by the way, I'll remind you what this is all about. In Pirkei Avot, God doesn't come up at all until chapter 2, Mishnah 12, which it says, and let everything you do be for the sake of heaven, which is so there is this awareness, it seems to be floating in the back burner consciousness of the rabbis. And maybe it's just, they thought it's just so obvious, or maybe they are actually actively dissociating themselves from God directly in order to make it clear that do this stuff first and God will follow, as opposed to listen for the voice of God and do whatever you think God is telling you, getting us back to the dilemma of prophecy, right? That there seems to be there is a problem in the rabbinic mind with everybody just thinking that they have a direct line to God now that the temple is destroyed. That's a real problem, right? It used to be that God's will was made manifest by the priesthood at the temple through the avodah rituals of sacrificial worship. Now that that's all gone, it's as if the rabbis are saying, well, how do we bring God into people's lives, but without letting them conclude that it's now all up to the individual? I'm going to go have a spiritual experience in the woods or the desert. God's going to tell me what to do with my life, and I'm going to go my own way. The rabbis obviously, I think, would view that as so threatening to the integrity of the Jewish community and the Jewish tradition that they write in such a way as to suggest that that's not on the table. So a few thoughts in response to yours. Michelle Brun.
So based on your invitation to consider the lead-in on 3 things the world has established, I also want to hearken back to your earlier little bit on the Noahide laws, which said for the most basic level of humanity, there's a defined set. Of course, the non-Jews certainly didn't know about it. There's a defined set of things that you have to do to be just human. And I'm wondering if this is sort of the next set up that says there's 3 things on the world is established. So in order to create a better world more generally, to somehow improve it or move forward, we have this sort of 3-legged stool.
That's great. And by the way, there are 2 places in Pirkei Avot chapter 1 where 3 things the world stands on is brought up. I think it's all in chapter 1. So this is the more famous, I think, as it were, in Jewish communities. This is the one that they turned into a song. But there is another Mishnah, and of course now I'm looking for it and can't find it. Now it's not in chapter 1. No, there it is. The last, I'll show you on the screen because it exists, I believe, in dialogue with Mishna Avot, with Pirkei Avot, chapter 1, Mishnah 2. when by the time we get to number, this is 18, right? I don't. Can you see it? Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, who comes much much later than Shimon HaTzadik. It's not the same Shimon. Both teachings are attributed to a Simon. This is a different Simon, Shimon. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel used to say, on three things does the world stand: on justice, on truth, and on the American way. I mean, on justice, truth, and on peace. As it is said, execute the judgment of truth and peace in your gates, from Zechariah, the prophet Zechariah 8:16. Notice he's quoting a prophet, by the way. There's that idea of appropriating the prophetic tradition for rabbinic purposes. So I would describe Shimon ben Gamliel as actually having the more universal or universalistic frame for the kind of fundamental principles. But you're not less right, Michelle, to categorize what's happening here in Mishna Avot chapter 1, section 2 as outlining fundamental principles for the establishment of the Jewish civilization, or maybe civilization as a whole, because it says the world stands on these three basic principles. The only issue is that Gentiles are not bound by Torah, Avodah, and Gimilut Chasadim. So for the rabbis, I guess the real question is, what do we mean by ha'olam, the world, right? They say the world stands on these three principles. These three principles appear to be incumbent only on Jews. Therefore, one might logically conclude, and this is just a little philosophy exercise that I've never done before, but as I hear what you've said, I want to throw out the possible argument that therefore the world stands on Jewish people doing these things, right? It's not actually baked into the way in which God set up the cosmos so much as when Shimon HaTzadik says the world stands on these three things, God requires Jews to keep the world standing. If there are no Jews, then there's no Torah, then there's no Avodah, then there's no Gimilut Chasadim, and life, civilization, decency, humanity as we understand it collapses, right? So that's and by the way, this is a beautiful response to the challenge of chosenness, where chosenness is often derided as a kind of claim to arrogance, an arrogant claim to superiority of the Jewish people and the Jewish tradition. Quite the contrary. Chosenness is a burden of responsibility on the Jewish people to be partners with the divine in tikkun olam, in repairing the world so that the world as it is becomes the world as it ought to be, as provided through the vision of the prophets and the teachers and the rabbis. I love this way of going with this. You've really opened up a new interpretive thought in my mind, Michelle, so thank you. Whereas Shimon ben Gamliel at the end of the Mishnah, the passage we just looked at a second ago, seems to be saying, no, the world is founded on truth, justice, and peace. Well, those are not specifically Jewish modalities or premises, right? Anyway, something to think about. Ivan, I see your actual hand up.
Yes, thank you. Actually, what I was thinking,
Oh, sorry, I accidentally muted mute. That was my bad. Let's start again. Just go back. You were thinking.
we do exist not only in our community, we exist in communities of the world, we exist in the community of many other beliefs, most of which parallel our intent to do tikkun olam the way they define it. And we have an obligation with COVID, what is it called? COVID, and what goes on in the political world, and what goes on in our expectation, what it will be. Nobody knows what's going to be. It is to be united in a greater good for the whole world in which we play our part.
Beautiful.
How does the community that you relate to, whether it is, even the Christian evangelical community, how do you get together? How do you coalesce? How do you teach each other the essence of that human belief that, first of all, we have to survive. And we have to survive not only in the physical sense, but from the environment to satisfaction to stuff to do, love each other all the days, but to make progress, because the human characteristic and wars have always be fought only with better weapons, you know, from the stick to the atomic bomb. How do we conquer all that?
I think that I'm going to conclude with just an affirmation of your inspiring call to understand what Judaism is really all about, right? The questions you're asking, Ivan, are the most profound and important in Jewish life. Ultimately, I think and I think this does flow directly from the text we're looking at today, but certainly your comments take me there. Ultimately, Judaism's purpose, look, there's no one definition. But I think that the definition I would give, particularly inspired by what you've just said and what our texts are bringing to us this morning, the purpose of Judaism is to model and create a more perfect world. Period. It's not just about benefiting the Jewish people. It's not just about performing rituals. It's not just about, affirming God with our words. It's about making God's presence real through thought, word, deed, and commitment. And we do that, of course, collectively. And we can't do that in a vacuum. And we certainly can't do Judaism only in our synagogues or only in our own homes. It is intended to be a public, shared enterprise. So particularly now, in a world where we are beset by political division and by a life-threatening pandemic that's only getting worse, Judaism's invitation or obligation is for us to do everything in our power for the benefit of all. I believe that so thoroughly and concertedly that it is a driving force in my rabbinate, and it's just so beautiful and meaningful for me to hear it affirmed by you and other members of our congregation. And that takes us to the end of our time for today. What a beautiful opportunity to study and live some Torah with you. And so grateful that we get to study Pirkei Avot. It's such an incredibly rich, dimensional text. I think we're going to have a lot of fun. And since you are all Mishna Mavens, I think that we were able today, I just want to point out how good you are. We were able today to have a very deep conversation because we didn't have to have a conversation about the mechanics of Mishnah, right? So think of Mishnah Brachot that we used not just to learn a lot about Judaism, which we did, but it was also a masterclass in studying how Mishnah functions. Just take everything you've already learned and bring it to what we're going to be studying over the many weeks to come. So God bless all of you. Stay healthy.
Oh, God bless.
Press the
Please
call
keep
off,
other
Rabbi.
people safe.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Talk to you soon. And I'll give a recommendation or two for a hard copy of
Okay.
Pirkei Avot when I send the email around. Be well. Bye-bye.
Love you.
Love
Bye.
you too. Bye, guys.